Please step forward, approach the podium to your right and our left. There being no citizens here to render comment, we've satisfied this element of the agenda. Next item on the agenda is approval of the July 5th, 2016 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do I hear a motion to approve?
So moved.
Do I hear a second? Any discussion or proposals to amend? There being none, all in favor of approving of the minutes, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All opposed, raise your hand and say nay. All abstaining, please raise your hand and say abstain. There being none, the minutes are approved. Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is Housing Strategy Plan, Affordable Senior Housing. I invite to the presentation the city staff and their consultants.
Good evening, Planning Commission. So we have Arthur Sullivan and Mike Stanger with us, who are with ARCH, a regional coalition for housing, and they are working with Kenmore along with other cities in the ARCH community on developing a housing strategy plan. So before we let Arthur and Mike loose to present their information, Laurie's just going to give you sort of a little background to kind of remind you where you've been and where we're going on this project. Okay?
Good evening. So the last time we talked about this was the first time we talked about the housing strategy plan on May 17th. So it's been a couple of months since you had that introductory meeting. And at that time, you'll remember we talked about a framework and an approach for discussing housing issues, affordable housing issues, and you agreed that we could divide it into different groups, different populations, and talk about those different populations and their specific needs, and then where the overlaps were, et cetera, as we looked at different strategies. So at that meeting, you also had asked for several pieces of information, and hopefully you received all of those tonight or in your packet. So the first one was a larger graphic showing cost burden households. That was attachment 1 to your packet. You also had asked to see a listing of other jurisdictions' approaches. That was attachment 3 to your packet. Attachment 4 is Kenmore's current regulatory approach, and it talked about how many units were provided using different approaches. And then we also included the housing needs, East King County housing needs analysis, which is something that was reviewed at the time of the development of the housing element, which was also included. And the housing element includes a lot of Kenmore-specific information about housing needs. So that's the information that has been provided. You also asked for some information from a series of stakeholders interviews that ARCH was conducting, and I think at least a portion of that will be presented tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Arthur and Mike.
Good evening. So I think the purpose of tonight, we have a couple purposes, is to look at sort of how to go about putting together a strategy where you can sort of get a sense of different strategies and how they compare to one another and things like that. So one of the first things we want to do in your packet, we sort of have a format sort of based on having similar discussions in the past with other cities. So I think the first thing we want to do is talk with you about that, see if it makes sense, explain it, and things along those lines to see if we start with sort of what's the right approach to trying to pull this together. Then the other thing we want to do is we did include the, the housing element and the needs analysis in the packet, and we thought we just should, if, to the extent needed, take time and revisit or see what questions or comments or things you may have. If in looking at that, those were done a year or so ago, so may be helpful just to make sure before we jump in that we give you a chance to see if you have any questions or comments on that material. Then we wanted to start talking, and then we do have some of that material that from our surveying. It's not all done, but I think it starts to give you a framework of the kind of people that we talked with and some of the different, we did it a couple different ways, and so we have a couple of different products for you to look at. I'm not sure how much we'll get into that tonight, but we do have that for you, and this is, you know, we will have several times to come back and talk with you about the strategy plan, as much time as you need. So then we want to then start, hopefully, we did try to organize the thinking and the discussion for you around, and we talked about this with the council, and we talked with you at the last meeting about this, around different populations and different types of households. So the idea tonight was to start thinking about strategies from the point of view of seniors and needs that they may have in the community. So at some level, it's to go through some of those with you tonight, and also open it up to you to see if you have other thoughts about strategies that you think might be relevant for the group to think about related to seniors. So I think those are probably the main things. Eventually, we want to get to a point of prioritization. You know, we do have several meetings coming up. I'm not sure if we'll have enough time to start getting into that tonight, but we can start talking about how you want to think about that. So those are the different things that we're hoping to sort of help in the conversation with tonight. If that makes sense, or if you have any questions about those items before we jump into it.
Anybody have questions? Let's jump.
Okay, so the first in your packet, there is a document that relates to, starting, I guess, on page, I guess it's on page 10 of your packet. Actually, I'm sorry. I guess it's attachment 2, I guess I want to refer to. And this is a document that we have used to sort of take a summary approach to having an ability to look at a variety of different strategies and think about different ways that strategies can be represented and organized in a way for you to be able to quickly kind of ascertain different strategies and compare them to one another. So the basic, I'll just sort of describe the format of these plans and then what other cities have done, and then open it up and answer questions about the information in here, and also what makes sense from your point of view. So most of the information in here is meant to be informational in summary form. So the first column is basically listing different strategies, and what we've done in that first column is attempt to organize those a couple of different ways. So it's not totally random. One is sort of looking at regulatory approaches, and then under regulatory approaches sort of break that out between sort of general development versus regulations that are more specific to different populations and things along those lines. So that's sort of the general intent. The one we prepared for now is only including strategies, as we'll see in a minute, that focus on potentially senior housing needs. So the idea is that over time, as we do more population groups, we'll keep adding to this chart, okay, kind of thing. So then the next, and then at the end of each of those strategies are numbers in parentheses, and that's where it corresponds to your housing element policies, or in some cases, eventually there'll be land use policies that the specific strategies potentially implement. In working with other cities in the past, the goal is in the end that when you have your complete list, you have strategies kind of linked to all those policies, and we're focusing more on affordability at the council's direction. So hopefully there will be strategies linked to all policies that are in your housing element. So that's the purpose of the first column. And we had intended, and I apologize, the intent was at the end of each subsection there be a blank line, because we want to have room to add in things from your conversation. So I apologize that didn't happen, but that was the intent. Is we're trying to say this is a working document, and we're not trying to say we think we have all the ideas. So that's an important point to make. So then the next columns, there's three, or section of columns, are what is the process of implementing the strategies, and And this is one where different cities have done it different ways, and I think in the memo we listed other ways cities have grouped them. But the columns are sort of like, is it a land use code update? So will it follow the type of process in the play? And that typically means the players involved would be the commission as well as the council and dealing with those. So it's sort of trying to get a feel for who are the players who need to be involved with implementing that particular strategy. The next column would be other things that are council action items, and so often those end up being things like donating surplus land or something, and that's an area that the council has said they want to be primarily in their camp to be discussing and figuring out and prioritizing. You probably will have some questions or comments along those, so we'll probably note those. Ultimately, the plan adopted by council will also include things in which they are the sole actor and maybe involve more direct assistance, both based on your conversation and the council's conversation. The things are more, there's a lot of interest in exploring how we can use other tools other than direct assistance, not off the table, but putting particular emphasis on the others, in other areas of action. And then finally, the third column is where they may be strategies where they're really going to be implemented more by other players, but you still may want to emphasize them and support them. And the best example I can give that's probably on the list tonight is there's a home repair program that's administered countywide, and so the county administers it, but it can be utilized in your community. So that's the purpose of that section, is to sort of distinguish who the players are ultimately going to be. The next section is then intended to say what income levels would most likely be need to be addressed through a particular strategy. And so we have a column for each of the explicit income levels that are called out in your comprehensive plan. Very low, which is 30% of median, low income, which is 50% of median, moderate, which is 80, and then market, because the intent is there can be a full range, and even market housing can serve different needs in the community, even relative to affordability. So again, that's what we do here, and we've attempted, and as you can see in each of these sections, we've attempted to say what we think it is. Now, you may say, hey, I thought this one might help this income level as well. Why didn't you put it in there? Or how does that help market? And that's, that we will work with you on that to the extent you have questions there or think that they should be filled in differently. And then finally, and this is sort of a new section for us, which is what household types or kinds of populations we've identified would this strategy do. Now, tonight's version, all of these are checked off. As we add more, they will be motivated, but there are certain strategies that when we're completed, you may find that, and even some of the ones in here may serve other populations other than just seniors. And so the idea here is, just like different strategies may address different income levels, different strategies may address different population groups. Obviously, somewhat subjective, but at least it's intended to sort of make that linkage between the different population groups you've identified and strategies that might work with them. That then leads to the last column, which is the ultimate goal of the conversations of a city, which is to prioritize. And what has happened in the past is typically a process in which we try to make the chart as complete as possible. Take all your policies. Hopefully when we're done, we've often done a cross-check document where we take the policies and say, oh, what are all the strategies that go with each one, so that you can look at it that way as well. And the intent is to have a pretty complete set, and then the next step isn't to sort of say, eliminate all the ones that we don't think are the top priority. Instead, it's been more of a process, prioritize all these. And typically it's been a 3-ranking system, high, medium, low, 1, 2, 3 different cities have used different rankings. I think everyone's used a 3-level kind of approach. You could do it different, or you can do something completely different. And the intent is, whatever you call your higher priority, is to sort of say, these are the ones we think over the next 3 to 5 years are the ones we should really focus on. And the exercise in the conversation at this point is to not necessarily come up with what is the action you're going to take with each of these strategies, but rather, from what we know of needs and what we sort of understand about what these potentially could do, this is a strategy we should really focus on and see if it can help us. So you're not trying to come up with the answers at this point. You're trying to come up with what are the things over the next 3 to 5 years we're going to spend a lot of time researching. and really deciding if they are and how is the best way to implement them in the city of Kenmore. And so I often use accessory dwelling units for in a lot of my examples. That's number 1C here. And you can see what we've also done here is we've actually got a couple of sub-bullets under several of these strategies, and we expect to do that in the future. And so what the idea is you might say, yeah, we like all three of those items under C, and we think they really may have potential. So that's what we want to look at, and we rank that at number 1, which means this is something we should work on now versus in the future. And then you would, if it's something that seems interesting but doesn't seem like a top priority, you might give that a medium. And then ones that may not feel very relevant to your city, you would give a low priority. And then there might be some you say, that would never apply in our city. Now, the example I typically use is manufactured housing. Bellevue doesn't have any community, so it really doesn't make sense to have strategy. You do, so that's not a good example for you. Those you would take out because it's just not part of any way that that could play out. The reason we suggest that approach is if you look at your comprehensive plan policies, it says work on strategies, evaluate them, and then after 5 years, reassess. And the idea being, look at the results you get from your high priority. If you happen to meet all of your needs in your community, then you're good and you're happy in your highest priority. But if you haven't, then you have these other things that were your mediums and lows and say, now that we've worked on our high, maybe we should revisit those. And they're still out there for you to think about and consider. Another reason for doing so is that your cities, and I work for you, and there's a Growth Management Act, and by leaving them in, even as a low, it at least says someday we might look at them. We don't think hopefully we won't have to, but they're out there. Then that gives you coverage of being able to say you have a strategy plan that has looked at the full range of needs, and you have identified a variety of strategies to address or potentially address. Even if things go well, you may not get to the lower priority strategies. So that's a consideration. Another reason, a secondary reason to think about. The idea isn't to try to get this down to 4 things. It's rather maybe get down to 4 to 6 things that are your top priorities. And then maybe in some cases more. And then the others you would just lower rank based on what you think your community needs are. Now, I'd like to also go back to that first column because of those sub-bullets that we put in there, the single I, double I, triple I. We've seen different cities when we give you multiple ideas, and again, using the accessory dwelling unit example, where the city might say, yeah, number 1 is really important, but number 3 isn't. And so some cities, and this is something, as we go through this, they may rank C as a group, ADUs, or they may rank each of the sub-items. So they might say, we want to work on number 2 right away, but let's hold off on number 1 because we just did that last year, and so we don't know why we want to re-review our ADU regs. We just kind of did that. So we haven't guessed at this point which ones you might want to sub-rank or not, but that's something that some jurisdictions have done. So that's kind of an overview of the approach from other jurisdictions that we've worked with, and now I sort of open up to you of questions, and does that feel like an approach that works, or do you want to talk about other ways to think about dealing with strategy plan?
Anybody? Mark?
I just had a clarifying question about direct assistance. Just to be clear, how off the table is that? Because I was looking through, our priorities are land use and regional efforts, it sounds like. To what extent might regional efforts involve funding? Is that included in direct assistance? I'm just trying to be clear on what exactly we're supposed to focus on from that perspective. Okay.
Do you want to?
Well, I think at the council meeting, they were interested in having the council be the decision makers on sort of anything that particularly involved financial commitments. Okay. Which would be sort of direct assistance. So they were saying they wanted to keep that in their court and let the Planning Commission focus on the others. But as Arthur said, if there's any comments you want to make towards that, you could. But in terms of detailed discussion, that would certainly be with the council.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Dennis.
just really some questions on our style. Is it feasible for us to do a little calendar of where you are at and thinking when we will move through these different stages? So we can start, and then we can keep track of when we're falling behind or we need to amend it. I don't really care, but I hate to sort of not know when we want to finish this. It sort of helps process it. And then the second thing that I was wondering about, there have been, probably for a long time, a lot of articles in the Seattle Times or other places about these type of issues. And I didn't know whether you had a clipping service or whether that's something we just do on our own or how we best handle local information, because I find that really useful to understand where we fit in our region.
We'd be more than happy to include in your packet a series of articles. We do try to collect them, and there, like you say, there have been a lot in the last year or so, so we'd be more than happy if we don't already have them to do searches and put a packet together, because I think that's a good idea. So we'd be more than happy to include that part to the first album.
And for the calendar, we can certainly put together a calendar outline for the forthcoming meetings, but I would say at least for the next 2 or 3 months that you will be focused on housing strategy. And the idea then would be to sort of move through each population. But we can put together more of a,
And I know it's very early, but it just starts to give us a sense of what's on our plate.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I really like the population served columns that you added there. And what came to my mind when I look with those, as always, is have a consideration of how this might correlate with the economic development and zoning that we've already done. We've already done some zoning with the idea that we wanted to encourage the settlement of certain types of particularly demographics within age populations within Kenmore. Be nice to be able, as we go through these, to understand how that reinforces or might conflict with those priorities.
Okay, that's a good idea. I like that.
The other thing, and I think we actually touched on this in our May meeting, is to the extent that we are looking to provide additional low-income housing, typically as you increase the number of low-income individuals within your community, there are also other ancillary services that those folks are going to need to be provided for certain other types of populations, particularly if you're talking more additional group homes and others. There may be some zoning, parking, access, transportation sorts of issues that would have to come along and be addressed along with those. So I just want to make sure we have that somewhere, particularly under when we talk about the population served, with those crossover impacts might be.
Good points, and I think as we're talking, you should bring those up and talk with, we'll be a resource and stuff, but all points well made. Agreed.
I'd like to follow up on what Dennis said about a calendar, because the wireless communication facility segment took so much longer than expected. I don't know where we are in terms of satisfying our docket for the year. And if we dedicate 2 or 3 months to this, where are we with respect to remaining docket items?
Yeah, so you had 3 items on your docket this year: communication facilities, the housing strategy plan, and neighborhood business zoning. And the neighborhood business zoning had a caveat that was if time allows. So if we anticipate that this project maybe goes into October, I mean, just looking at meetings twice a month and how many population groups there are, and then time to prioritize or a public hearing, it may be October or so. So maybe by the end of the year, we'd be in a position to think about taking up the neighborhood business zoning. But you're fine as far as the docket goes. You're accomplishing the tasks that you were assigned.
Okay. And one thing we don't have a feel for yet is, do we need, maybe some we combine two in the same night. You might be able to do more than one. I think tonight, for sure, we only want to do one because we're sort of feeling our way through it right now. But we may find as we go forward. If you need one per population, that's great. We're here. It's on our calendars to help you to the extent needed. So,
can we get a sort of a pro forma calendar?
Yeah.
That says here's where we expect to be at,
Right.
and
We've
here's
already
where we
talked
expect
with
to move into.
Arch about that. We'll see how tonight's meeting goes, and that'll give us a better sense of how much time we need to address these different groups.
So Mike, you said that in our regional business zoning, which is the extent to which we have recommended zoning to the city council, I think we did a little bit of some other regions too. I can't remember, but you said they were sort of demographically directed, and I may misunderstand you there.
Demographically directed may be an overstatement on my part, but when we talked about, for instance, multifamily, multi-use, we talked about what sort of populations we'd expect to be in there, what the demand for those would be, and we zoned accordingly. So if we're going to now develop a housing strategy, I think there's a correlation that has to happen between those two so they don't get sideways of each other.
Yeah, and I can see where you're coming from there. When I look at this demographic or target group breakdown, I'm trying to remember, is this something that the council expressed preference for? And that's why we're doing it? Because I know you said you have agreed that this is the way to go.
Well, so the notion of reviewing it by population served, yes, was vetted with the council.
Right.
And the Planning Commission added one item, which was that last group, which was families with children, low-income families with children. So the other four were addressed with the city council.
Did they explain why they wanted to focus on certain groups that would benefit from this?
I think that was the recommendation, that those groups might be appropriate, and they concurred.
Yeah, the staff recommended that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, if that's what they want, of course, I'm not going to challenge it. My view of this issue is that housing affordability is a hardship. And whether you belong to the senior category or young families or workforce, I'm not quite sure how that's a demographic category, but does it suit the needs of the workforce, maybe what you're getting at? I don't know why I would put one group's hardship ahead of another group's hardship. When I think of a single income family and somebody's been laid off, that doesn't, I don't know, make them any less deserving than the seniors having trouble affording housing.
The prioritization is not between the populations served, it's between the strategies. So maybe you would be interested, for example, in a strategy that served more groups than just a single group. So it's not that you're placing priority between seniors, young adults, the homeless, and families with kids. You're looking at a range of strategies and then prioritizing which are going to be the most effective, and maybe, you may choose a strategy that serves multiple populations.
And I think, going back to my opening comments, because I agree completely what you're saying, sort of two things to think about why I have this section. One is, a lot of people in the community, they don't think of, oh, we're helping people at 50% a meeting or 30. They think, I know someone who's trying to work here as a retail worker and they're having a hard time living here. I know a senior on fixed income. So one reason for doing this is it makes it a little easier for people to think about what are the populations in our communities that we think we have. And when we did that and looked at the data, these were ways of describing some of the needs in a way that works for people who think about families in their community. So that was one reason to do it, to sort of give it a little more context for the different things you're trying to do. The other is, and people saying, hey, you're right, these are all good things, and these are all important areas. So let's make sure then what the balance part, which is what I was saying in the beginning, is if you do all strategies and you realize none of them would help seniors, well, at least now you'll be conscious of that or not. In other words, saying, oh, and some of these will have multiple, or so will it feel like that the balance of things you're doing might land on, or if you don't, you added families. If you do everything, you might not have anything that's trying to help, people with children or households with children. So this is just meant to be something to help inform the discussion around the strategies. It isn't trying to create a competition between one and the other. It's just to help give some context, and maybe, just like I said in the beginning, when we work with cities, we think it's important to have strategies that aren't all just for one income level, that there's different kinds of income levels. So don't just have all strategies for very low or all for moderate. Try to have a mix, and whether or not in the end You try to do the same thing with populations. That's something you'll talk about as you start seeing them cumulatively.
Well, if that's how the commission wants to go and the council wants to go, I'm not going to fight it, but you could do that with any issue. You could say any issue, well, we come up with a formula or a proposal, and ultimately it benefits these groups. It may or may not benefit these other groups as much. And you could sell it, so to speak. You know, from your comments, I'm taking it as sort of a marketing proposition that people will understand this issue better if they connect what we're proposing to people they know who fit into certain demographic categories. Well, you could do that with or without, breaking it down as part of the analysis. To me, it seems like it sort of gets in the way of what's the most efficient way to provide affordable housing to everybody. And if it benefits, and at the end of the day, you come up with an efficient policy, and you'll see if it's the most efficient, it's likely to benefit the most people who can't otherwise afford it, and that would include all these different segments. If there is some segment that has, for some reason, an unusual needs a different strategy, I could see that. And I think with seniors that may be true because they're in such a different situation a lot of times. You have these adult family homes. That's a senior-oriented housing product. So maybe we look at adult family homes, with extra focus because of that. But I don't see it as, in terms of our policy making, helpful for us to see, let's look at seniors tonight, and let's look at workforce tomorrow, and let's work at, and I know you want to overlap to some extent, but I think we look at what's efficient first. But go ahead, Kathy or Carol.
I think one of the reasons that I recall that senior housing was kind of at the top of the list is it is the driving demographic of our culture. I mean, the reality is the people that were born from 1940 to 1965 have driven everything since the 40s of what we do as a market, government, schooling, whatever you want to call it. It's a demographic that we can't ignore. And seniors actually live longer, maybe not as healthily as we'd like them to, but people are living longer, and that demographic is huge. So I think maybe that's what I recall is that number as a demographic is really big, and it's not going to go away. But you juxtapose that with the economic realities of our city that have really played havoc with our housing affordability in the Seattle region. So we have kind of the perfect storm is going to start happening. It already has. So when you come up with these strategies, are you really looking at some of the real facts? Will you be supplying, some of those real numbers to us as an organization? Because I know that you are kind of our resource, our expert in the field, so to speak, and essentially our city partners with you so that we can make good decisions.
Right, and I'd turn it around. We're your staff for the next 2 months on this topic. So if you need information, we'll do our best to find related information.
Okay.
I think, Commissioner Nugent, your point is well made about efficiencies and things. And what you're almost describing, as I said, this chart is meant to be informational up to that last column. I think what I'm hearing you talk about, which is good, what are the things that are going to help drive you in deciding what should be a priority? And what you're saying is it may not be so much population served for you, it may be efficiency, and that's fine. And maybe that's part of what, I'm not sure we should get into that tonight, but what are the things that you want to think about when you start getting to prioritization? And what should be things other than is there things that aren't explicitly on this chart? Maybe there's a column you want to add to the chart so when you're done, that's showing, okay? That's what we want. That's sort of part of what we want to talk about tonight before we get going, is to have you start thinking through what will help you get to the point of determining prioritization of different strategies. So that's...
Well, I guess I leave it up to the commission, as we would in any case. Do we really want to focus on groups like this? Or do we want to focus on have a different perspective, perhaps? Take the demographics out and look at what policy will relieve the most housing affordability hardship in this city, regardless who, what category they belong to. I agree that the baby boom generation is the biggest one. It's growing, it's aging, and it's a huge factor in any of these decisions, but that's going to be reflected if we look at the citywide. They're just a big chunk of the population. Well, they're also a big chunk of the housing affordability issue. So we're not ignoring them if we take a broader perspective. The other thing is, I'm not sure this really suits the hardship thing. If I look at attachment 1, page 3, I'm looking at senior renters. I'm looking at the percentage of housing burden borne by senior renters versus all renters, and it looks to me like the percentage of the housing burden for all renters is higher than senior renters. If I go to page 4, senior homeowners seem to have less housing burden, cost burden for housing than all homeowners. So it seems ironic to me that we're putting these, for housing affordability, people who have less of a burden over other categories, and that's just one of the distortions. I mean, it sounds good, because we know seniors. We know some have housing affordability issues. They have a lot of other issues, too, and so they're a very sympathetic group. We all have parents, or did, and it's a difficult experience. So I know it's sympathetic, and that should be part of our analysis anyway. It's sympathetic to be handicapped. It's sympathetic to be without a job. It's sympathetic to be lots of things. Chronically ill, without a car, uneducated. But I don't see that helps us make a better policy as our first priority. But that's me, and if others don't share that, that's fine, and we'll just move on.
Maybe you could refresh our thinking about what, like countywide and just in our region, why housing affordability is the issue. Because I think if you talk about that a little bit, it'll be easier for us to look at these different groups and start to come up with some creative strategies to help mitigate that. Because I think that's really what's driving this issue in the first place is, how come we're here? What do we need to do about it?
So when you look at the countywide and we say here are the needs, I will go back and a couple comments to your points. One is I would go back and say part of this exercise, there's an element of this is you write comprehensive plans because of the Growth Management Act. And strategy plans do say, or GMA says, you will do a housing needs analysis, which you've got, and then it says you will develop policies and strategies to address the range of needs you identify in your strategy plan. So part of what this is doing is the by-the-book thing, okay, of saying we understand that we did identify that there are needs in these different kind of areas that we've shown, and we're documenting how strategies may impact them. Now, I will also say we have done it more in the past along the lines of how you described. And so I'm not, this is a good discussion. That's what we're here for tonight. But I would say I am encouraged to do something like this because it does help make that correlation there. But that correlation, I think, also helps the community in conversation. Because I've been in so many meetings, and I don't hear people come in. I hear people come in and tell stories about these columns and not tell stories. That doesn't mean you, as your job, shouldn't be doing the things you're saying. But this still helps in putting context to a community and the needs that are out there to know when you're done, how do they match up to potentially helping these wide range of demographics. I've always focused on the columns on income. Okay, that's been my focus in the past. But I'm learning as I do this more, the vast majority of people in the community, also that helps them to think through and understand strategies and why they would potentially want to work on them. Now, the other practical element to this is we did put this out there to the council and they said, we like this idea, do it. So that is a component. Now, given all that, there are a couple ways to go, which is we may, and this gets into when do we do the prioritization. What we may do, and this is where, in terms of calendaring, we wanted to have the conversation tonight, what we may do right to do this, maybe the way to respond to your comments is we will still do by population, but do it mostly as add to the list. So that, and talk about things that group or along those lines and bring them forward. And don't start the prioritization conversation until they're all out there for you to have. But at least advance each, you know, and maybe that's why we maybe combine a couple population groups the same night, because there aren't huge differences on some of them. So maybe one way of doing this is roll out the strategies. Instead of dumping you all 10 pages, 8 pages at once, we've got one subset for you tonight. Talk about it around seniors, and don't worry too much about the prioritization at this point. Just worry about understanding the strategies, and don't say you can, you know, say, well, wouldn't this strategy also help the others? And we say yes, and stuff. And so our goal is once we have a complete list of the strategies, we would have all the bubbles filled in. So that's maybe something to think about, is maybe we just, instead of, you know, is take a couple meetings to get all the strategies on the table and around the population, and then start the prioritization discussion. So maybe that's a way.
That actually makes not only sense to me, that's what I assumed we were going to do.
Okay.
When I looked at this, it was really looking at it, this is an approach to the work, and you could approach this work in many ways.
Right.
But what I found sensible about this is it gives you a way to at least begin to break down the major categories, demographics, and say, okay, what are the issues specific to each one of these? You've got all your regulatory approaches. So what I was assuming would happen is, as we go along, we'd be filling out these boxes, and at some point we'd have at least a visual and some documentation we could go back to and say, okay, this regulatory approach seems to hit a substantial portion of the population. Now we can think about prioritization. Here's one that's very limited. It's a very small part of the population, big investment. We wouldn't go there. So at least for myself, I mean, whatever people think helps them think their way through it.
Right.
But that's what I liked about this. It's something I've seen before, and it's workable. While I have your attention, I just want to have one clarifying question. This has been stated to be the housing strategy plan, but what I keep hearing is that this is really an affordable housing strategy plan. It would be good to be able to say that right up front.
Point. Yes.
So we know what we're talking about, because we're not, it appears to me, right or wrong, we're not asking the question, for instance, what is the best regulation applicable to the senior population or young adults? We're saying for those people who are low income, what's an affordable strategy? And that's a very different question and set of approaches.
Yes.
So, so just, that's what we're doing. We're talking about affordable housing.
Yeah.
Getting back to the calendar, just to be compulsive, did we also say we're matching the council and not meeting in August?
No, we did not.
We did not. Oh.
But that is sort of a question that probably on the others before you adjourn, to say that, you know, there are 2 scheduled meetings in August, and do we have a quorum? We were assuming that you would be meeting in August, as you have done in the past.
Actually, I think we skipped some of last August.
Normally we match.
Yeah, right.
In the 3 years I've been on it, so.
I get the sense we're a little behind the curve with the wireless communication time that we spent.
The wireless communication took a little longer than we anticipated, so, but again, we were still thinking you would be meeting in August. But if there's no quorum, then you won't, and we'll just have to push things out a little bit more.
Would it, and I don't know where people sit on this, you know, with respect to whether we do this by demographic category or we do it by strategy, my thought was that income would be the driving issue or driving factor, because that's where the hardship is. It's lack of money. Hence the word affordable in our topic. And would it throw you guys off if we looked at it in terms of strategies that help low-income people pay for housing, instead of looking at seniors one day and workforce the next, and entry-level job seekers?
I think what I would do in that case is it's sort of, you're going to do Section B first, then Section C, that way. Not by income, but more by how the strategies kind of group together. I think doing it just focusing on the income level is challenging, especially with the direction from Council of Direct Assistance being more in their purview.
Okay.
So I would suggest that, I think in the end, we do have to be able to talk about the populations and going back to council, but an alternative way to do it is to do it by the subsections that you have, like Section B and then Section C, and doing it that way. So that would be an alternative approach.
I'm looking at your attachment 2, and there's a B, there's regulatory approaches under A, and B is direct and indirect assistance, and C is regional and statewide initiatives.
Right.
Which B are you talking about? 'Cause
So
there's
what I'm
subsections.
saying is you would do regulatory, and you might even split that up. There's a one which is infill, increased capacity, that are related to sort of overall, and then there's support, regulations targeted to more specific populations. So, and then you have housing affordability is a third subcategory under regulatory approaches. Then you have direct and indirect assistance, and then you have regional and statewide initiatives. So, and then you have oversight and monitoring, which is probably a little more straightforward. So
Right.
I'm sort of saying you go by those groupings rather than by the population served approach.
But I think
Yeah.
ultimately we still want to get to being able to know the population served,
Right.
because I think that's what council were also very interested as a sort of an end result, is making sure that they could have something that showed the income served and the populations served. So they definitely want to see that filled out.
Right, and I'm fine with that. In fact, that's our instruction, so that's got to be in there. I'm just saying, is it a more efficient way of doing it to look at this by regulatory approaches and these sort of functional proposals instead of whom they serve is sort of our guidance, it's sort of our pattern of going through this. But it sounds like we can do that readily with what you got.
Working for you.
Yeah, I mean, let's say we come up with a half a dozen proposals that we think will help efficiently relieve the burden of housing affordability.
So we're not like
and
a
then we can say, well,
right.
and here's who it serves.
So we're not like a
It's sort of an
consultant
afterthought.
who put together a work program that the city's paying us $25,000 for, and you just change the work program on us. We're your staff, and when
Yeah.
you ask staff to do things differently, we say, of course we'll try.
And that's why I said, is it going to throw you off? I don't want to waste,
Right.
You've prepared some of this already. I don't want to,
Right.
have you go back to square one and redo it.
Right.
I do think that this discussion needs to be between the commission, because I've heard two different comments from the commission. So the commission needs to weigh in on this.
I agree. So are there preferences on this? Mike's weighed in, I've weighed in. Dennis?
I like the way that you're starting to suggest we go, but recognizing we have to do something with the population served, I'm a little concerned about only having that type of division shown, because I think it oversimplifies it. We've already heard about the differences between whether you're renting as a senior versus owned. It also matters whether you're a single senior versus a couple senior. And it relates to the needs that you have with the income that you have. So some of those divisions could go across each of those categories. I even would comment on that we had statistically thought that the baby boomers they're obviously aging and going to have those impacts. But as a point of fact, the average age, the median age is under 35, I think.
It's around 35. It's
Yeah.
like 37.
So we've got to be careful of not assuming what used to be a fact is no longer. And that's why I was a little concerned about having very narrow usages of words when we know there are a lot of other categories that need to be part of that demographic review. But I agree we need to eventually know how it's going to impact those. But I like your idea of focusing on the traditional.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think I like that idea too. And I just another distinction that's not necessarily explicit here is between multifamily and single family. It seems like most of these are geared to multifamily, but what do we read? I think 25% of the population of Kenmore is renters. Did I get that figure correct in the housing element? So maybe it's just to be clear about, are we serving a multifamily population, the multifamily situation in Kenmore, or is there any elements of these that address, single-family neighborhoods, which are the, majority of homes in Kenmore? So maybe that's a comment as well as a question in terms of approaching. How do you?
I'd like to come back to
make
that
that
after you
distinction.
finish this discussion, because I think you raised a
Okay.
point that I'd like to come back to revisit,
Okay.
but finish this current conversation first.
Anybody else? Mike?
I'll just say, again, I think you could approach this efficiently from either way. If people think this is, it's easier to think about this from a strategy forward and then document, the population, the income served, the other columns based upon strategy, walk through, fine. I can get behind and understand that. I just want to make sure these guys aren't getting paid by the hour.
Yeah, I want them to work efficiently too.
So I think we can get to the same place from either approach.
Right.
Other people feel more comfortable, and I don't feel strongly about starting. And I didn't really see this as parsing this out necessarily as population served. But how do you cut and paste this together? How do you approach it? You can go either way. So if people are going, think strategy is a way to do it, that's fine. But I think it's going to change their way of thinking and how they're going to approach it. And that's my only reservations.
Are we making it hard on you
No,
by doing this? Okay.
no. And all,
Are we getting
because,
paid by the hour?
no. And even if we were, it's, the way this arch works is it's sort of like your staff. We get in the work we can get done, and everybody has really liked the idea of understanding the population served, but we've never quite done the conversation this way. So this is a very good, I told staff this afternoon, today the main thing today, and let's not even think about prioritization today, is getting you to a point of how you're going to get through this plan. So
Right,
this
I
is-
agree with that. I don't think
Yeah.
we're going to get there anyway today.
Right.
We're going to make
Yeah.
distinctions based on,
So no, this
Right.
is,
okay.
I'm hoping here we're all going to learn together about the right way to have this conversation.
Okay.
So is there a difference between the right way and a creative way?
I have no clue. Whatever gets you guys being the most creative is the right way.
Okay.
And I can't say for sure what that is.
And so what's really driving our conversation is, as a city, we want to provide for our citizens, but we're also a player in the region. And our land use and many other parts of our housing element are kind of governed by the Growth Management Act, correct?
Right, but what I'm saying is we picked these because of your demographics.
Okay.
So,
That helps.
but like I say, when that comes out and how that comes out, that element of it can work a lot of different ways. So the
Okay.
way has been proposed is definitely can work, because yes, we will be talking about some, if we did it this way, we'd be saying, oh, and keep in mind that some, ADUs is an example. Well, I actually think that can help young adults, that can help a couple of others. So there's so much overlap both ways that there is no right way.
Okay.
So it's where your head can wrap around it the best. So.
All right. Any more on that one? The approach element? Okay.
I'd like to come back to a comment you made, because one thing that I think would be helpful to do, and I don't, again, we may want to wait a meeting or two and to give you enough time to really start having discussion, that we sit down at some point and say, what are things that are going to help us screen these to prioritize them? So I've already heard two different things tonight that might be worth considering. Efficiency. But also you're saying, well, we're 75% single family. So we want strategies that are somehow linked into, even though for affordable housing, it's hard to do single family because of the cost of it, but it's 75% of your supply. So maybe that says ADUs, it's going to come back a lot. You're going to hear me say ADUs a lot. Or home repair. it might be an important thing to really think harder, again, you don't necessarily know what the answer is in the next 2 months, but you go, home repair is something we really should highly prioritize to study to see if we can do something because it's so much of our housing supply. And to illustrate that point, Mercer Island 20-some-odd years ago sort of went through and said, we're single family, and so we think for us, accessory dwelling units is a really important fit and mix and stuff. Now, and they really emphasized that. And while they didn't have a strategy plan, through their comp plan process, they really did think about that hard, and they really called it out. And they sort of almost put themselves on the spot that they had to do it. Well, their delivery of ADUs in their city, and I can't totally explain why, is at a rate that's like 6 times yours.
Wow.
And if you had built them at the same rate they did, you'd have, I think, another 150 versus the 30 you have today. Okay? So, yeah, so I think single family, do we have strategies that are trying to think about the single family neighborhoods could be one of your priorities or screening criteria. But what I'm saying is, I didn't walk in this room saying, if you'd asked me do this, the 2 things, yours would have been on my list, but yours maybe wouldn't. So I think letting some conversation happen around strategies and questions you raise, and I'm writing down ones that might then, I think 2 or so conversations in, we should then have just a complete conversation, potentially, or not necessarily a whole night, but a subset conversation. What's a good list of things for us to think about before you do start ranking? So
Yeah, and I like that we're kind of brainstorming here at the outset. We did that at the last meeting.
Yeah.
It's more efficient to kind of get
Yeah.
a common sense of what's important
Yeah.
and how we approach it. I just want to say, the word efficiency gets thrown around a lot. And I'll tell you what I mean by it. Value is a good synonym for it. We're like every city, one of limited resources. How can we get the most benefit, housing benefit? And you could interpret that as relieving housing affordability burden or cost burden that you've called for each dollar we spend on a project. And not just what the city spends, because we're not dealing with direct subsidies. We're talking about indirect and zoning and land use policy. But how does it fit in with the rest of our priorities as a city? Because we've got infrastructure needs, we've got public safety needs, we've got parks, we've got economic development. The policy that we propose, will that detract or cost something that we can't spend on those other important priorities? So when I say efficiency, can it fit in nicely with all those other important goals for Kenmore? And can we get the most for the resources we put into it or the policies we impose? Can it do the most with the least burden on either the city's money or other people's money and use of their property? I think I like some of the things you proposed, and I think there are a lot of ways to do that. I like some of the things I'm reading about that other cities have done too. So there's a lot to work with. Go ahead, Mike.
I think what we're beginning to talk about is some list of guiding principles, and I think value is number one. I always like to approach it that way. I think when we talk about single family, and this is my word, I'm not putting anybody else's into this, but we are largely a single family community. Would one of our guiding principles be that we want to work within that single family environment? I mean, you could look at some of your strategy toolkit over here, and we could go out and attract tens of millions of dollars in low-income housing and build a whole bunch of low-income housing. The only place we'd be able to do that would probably be to supplant single-family neighborhoods with that. Is that something we want to do? I'm giving you a radical example, but I think it's hopefully illustrative. Do we have a guiding principle that says something like we do not look to substantially destabilize our current housing mix? Things like that we can go back to as we're looking at each one of these strategies, thinking about how it impacts both the income level and the population served. What does this really do to the community as a whole? Is that really where we wanted to go with this? So if others have other thoughts on other guiding principles, but
I think it's a good idea. I mean, it's sort of like, how do we see this issue fitting in with the rest of what we're trying to do as a city? If you look at our vision statement, I mean, I think affordable housing may be on there, but, you know, the single-family communities and neighborhoods is a really high item on that list. Economic development is a really high item on this list. Parks and recreation are a really high item on that list. And it may be helpful right up front to say, okay, where does this fit in with that scheme? It's an item. Is it higher than those? Is it higher than what other land use concerns we have? There's a lot of steep slopes. There's a lot of wetlands. There's a lot of environmental protection needed in this city. Under state law, we don't have enough choice. We have to do a certain amount of environmental protection, so that limits the land we have for, you know, affordable housing.
Right.
I think that really would help with our prioritization, and I think when we eventually go back to the city council and try to explain to them why we made these priorities, why we made these choices, I think if we can go back to some set of guiding principles, which may be nothing, an elaboration of the city's vision, that's an easier thing to explain to the city council and for the city council to explain to the community.
And if I could add, I don't think we came into this room thinking we were going to change the baseline of your housing. This is about the as the point was made, we're focusing on affordability. It's going to be, so I think acknowledging that and making sure we iterate what those principles are. I think they're all. I think I like these ideas, and I'd like to help you play around with those and see how we can use those to help focus that process.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
And again, yeah, like I'd say, put some out there tonight, but let's not stop that, because as we talk about these strategies, other ideas on guiding principles, as you're calling them, may come up. So I wouldn't want to jump too quickly. I am writing these all down, though, as you're talking tonight.
Deborah?
Yeah, I think this is what people are already saying, but so for each of these strategies as we go through them, it'd be great to have little boxes or something in the grid ultimately that shows whether they're impacting single-family households versus multi or both, rent versus owner housing, and the total number of units that they that strategy may impact. I mean, maybe it's every place, maybe it's, you know, making 20 units more affordable, you know, I mean, it would give us a sense of that efficiency or value.
Right. So. And that's where it's going to get really challenging, because I do this all my life, because is a program that creates 100 units but needs a ton of cash resources better than one that creates 20 or 30 but doesn't need cash resources? It's building upon what the market's already doing or what neighborhoods are doing and stuff. And that's where it gets trickier, but you raise, I think, things that people like to try to understand better, and I'm just letting you know that as you keep getting deeper and deeper into some of those things, it gets murkier and murkier, especially with housing, because you create a roadmap for others to do things. It's not like parks. You create a roadmap and then you try to find the funds to build the parks, and you build the parks. You're trying to create a roadmap and hope people come along for the ride that you're painting. And some things you're more directly involved in and some less directly involved in. So the numbers parts gets trickier, and it may, we're having conversation with other cities, and I'm trying to figure out ways to help people think through that, and we may have, as we get further down the road, have some ideas on how to play around with some of that stuff.
So this kind of is helping me brainstorm a little bit, and it makes me, and it's brought to mind what I think may be a really helpful way to approach this, because as a pragmatist, I see a lot of issues as zero-sum. You know, if we shift more resources, or we have a land use policy that does this good thing, it may do less of this other good thing. And then that's what prioritization is. We have to decide which one's more important. You know, Mark brought up single-family neighborhoods, and what kind of a strategy is suitable for a city with 74% homeowners, as opposed, and 26% renters. We got to look at ourselves and see what suits us. It's not going to be the same policy that suits Seattle or Renton. We're in a very different position. And it also highlights, okay, what are the conflicts? You know, if we focus on preserving single-family neighborhoods and minimizing density or not increasing density, then we're really focusing all the density issues on what's already zoned for more density, multifamily. What about parks? What about, you know, are we giving up park space if we give up surplus land? for affordable housing? Are we interfering with critical areas? Are we, that kind of thing. So I wonder, and you, because you do this all the time, you probably have a good sense of where are the conflicts? What are the either-or questions? Does density interfere with single-family neighborhoods? Do ADUs? What's your experience with neighbors' reactions to having a broader, more liberal ADU policy? I think ADUs is a great proposition in a city like this for providing more housing stock.
So that's helpful.
But I don't know what your experience is or what the broader experience is. I mean, we saw the proposal. I don't know who's following the housing debate. Obviously, Dennis is to some extent in the Seattle Times, and it's a raging debate. With HALA and the city of Seattle, and proposals are coming out, every other week, and you see some surprising reactions, public reactions to a affordable housing proposal.
Right.
So that's what I'm kind of wondering is, can you crystallize? And those are hard things to say. What are the opposing merits?
There are, and in fact, when we give you the handout, and the handouts aren't complete, and the handouts, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, and I think I'd like, given how this conversation's going, now you're getting into really complex, literally, this is all I've done for almost 40 years, okay? And I've done it in a lot of different angles, even though I've been in the local government for a long time, but I've done it for many cities, and my head goes twirling around like crazy. But you made the comment of zero-sum game. I got hired because I worked for a company that didn't do zero-sum. It's how do you become additive? Okay, so I don't necessarily agree it's a zero-sum game. There are times where it's trade-off, but there are times when resources are being used in a way that aren't very efficient, i.e. single-family homes that are like mine. My kids are now grown up, and I still got 3,000 square feet. It didn't shrink down to 1,500 square feet. The kids aren't driving around anymore in the neighborhood. So it feels at times like it's a give and take. But the secret, when I've been around things that work well, it's finding that it isn't so much give and take, it's an alignment to get to some place that doesn't naturally occur because of just how individual behavior can be. Now I could get into like lectures and kind of stuff like that, and I'm not. But at your point about understanding give and take, what I like is what you were saying a few minutes ago, several of you, about what are our other, these guiding principles, and the guiding principles are going to probably be at a couple different levels. One's going to be about your efficiency for getting housing, affordable housing done. But some are going to be about fitting into the community and what our plans are. And as long as I've been doing it, one of the first things I learned a long time ago is, I've only worked in suburbs, is we have to find ways to fit in. We're not here to change what your community is. We're here to try to find ways that things that aren't working well, that when you talk about it, you care about, we might get closer to. And so it's important to have both of those on the table in the conversation, because if you don't, you'll have HALA. HALA didn't do the second. And so when it hit the streets, people were like, what about my neighborhoods? You're totally disrespecting my neighborhood angle. I read the HALA report for one ad, and I went, they have a problem, because of how they handled that discussion. But I've helped a number of cities write AD ordinances, and usually by the time we have a conversation from a community point of view, people go, wait a minute, Mercer Island, let's do more. You've done it so far, it hasn't hurt us, let's get more done. But that's because there was a respect of fitting in. So I think these guiding principles need to hit both of those angles as you're talking them through.
Right, and by zero-sum, I mean, maybe that's not the right phrase. There are usually some degree of conflicting interest, even with
yes,
and even with ADUs.
Yes, exactly.
Because I'm sure you've heard it. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are people in Mercer Island going, "Gee, I wish there wasn't all these ADUs. I wish there wasn't this, separate unit in the backyard of my neighbor's house because they park all over the street and they're a pain and they're loud and all this stuff." And we've heard the reaction or seen the reaction of Seattle to let's make the neighborhoods denser.
Right.
Let's compare Seattle to all these other cities and look at density. Mm-hmm. And Seattle's a much less dense city for one of its size than the rest of the country. So it's reasonable to propose more density in Seattle to create more housing stock to increase supply and reduce the price.
Right.
And the reaction was outrage. All right?
Yes.
Okay. And it was dropped.
Right.
Right? So that's what I want you guys to tell us.
Okay.
Is, okay, what's the opposing interest? Because I could just predict, oh, the planning commission said we ought to have a much broader liberal ADU policy, and people go, wait a minute.
Right.
And I want to hear from you, how does that play out?
So that's where I'm going to put the thing we hand out tonight. You don't see that neighborhood perspective in here at this point. That doesn't mean we don't care a ton about it. The purpose of this was to take the experts and just let them talk, okay? And that in no way reflects how I've ever approached ultimately getting somewhere, especially since I've worked in East King County. And when I did development, I only did development in suburbs in California. I grew up in a suburb. My father's an elected official. I get it. and so I want to respect that. So all your points are totally no convincing on this side of the table of trying to help you have that conversation.
Right. I know I've already talked too much. Anybody else? Mark?
Well, I just,
and then Dennis.
Sure, okay. Well, I just want to reiterate the idea that several others have mentioned about, putting all these policies and strategies in context and how they affect other aspects. I think Mike mentioned the economic development earlier. Transportation is obviously another one that comes to mind. So yeah, as we're going through this process, I want to certainly endorse that idea that we have as good an understanding as possible about the, trade-offs, consequences, and effects. So I just want to endorse that principle.
The key principle I've had for why I came here in the first place was economic development. It's your jobs and what they pay and what people can afford. And how do you keep recruiting? The company I work for is one of the largest nonprofits in the country, formed by the business community in California to say somebody's got to figure out a way to house our workforce. So we're going to incorporate you guys and give you money, and you go out and make it happen. So my core is around dealing with the primary driver I see in East King County, which is an incredible array of, a lot of jobs, but an incredible array of costs or incomes of those jobs. And we're hearing it more and more from the business community that recruitment, retention, talk to school districts, that's part of, so we'll bring that back and try to give some context to those kind of issues.
Dennis?
We've been talking about guiding principles, and I think we probably need to start making a little page and listing them. They won't be perfect, but it might start us thinking about what they should be.
Okay.
And that first one might be proper balancing of all elements for the city, which includes housing and
so
development.
we can start doing it. I mean, I've got 5 already, I think, as sort of rough ideas. And what we can do is with each staff report, just have a section on that as a working section of the document, if you'd like, if that would be helpful.
I would love it. And I'm wondering if we could have one of our guiding principles. If we propose this, it will affect these other goals in the city this way.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not easy to quantify that, but you could say, okay, if we have increased density in this,
So as long as this is a iterative, we're all working on this together, so if we send something out and it doesn't look what you thought it was, and you don't get mad at us. Because we're doing this one on the fly. I mean, I like the idea, and I'm suggesting something, and I don't know quite how it'll play out, but let's give it a try. And
you only have to keep 4 of us happy.
But it's
that's
gonna,
not the goal.
But the 4 will change every week.
It'll change, but just so you know.
I have been in those
if you
rooms.
get 4
so.
every meeting, you're on the right track. Right, so do you want to, should we talk about a list of, should we bring out the vision statement and say, let's look at this, and where does housing fit, affordable housing fit into relative to these other things?
I'd like to make sure we cover the other bases tonight, and if we have some time, we can come back to that. But I would like to at least get, because it's 8:15. I'd like to get the other materials in your hand and explain what they are.
Okay.
And we've already got something to start working with just from the conversation so far, but if you want to visit some more, great. But I would like to get to that other piece so that, again, like I say, as you're reading it and we add to it, you get it and stuff. So. And also, before we do that, you have a housing element. I said I promised that one of the things we should do tonight is we gave you 2 longer documents. And if you have any immediate questions or comments on that, That would be helpful to also do right now. If not, that's fine. I just wanted to, since we were given all that, see if there's any immediate questions or comments about that material.
Anybody? Mark?
Yeah, I did have one that came up, I think it was early on in there. It talked about I think if I read this correctly, the pushback against ADUs in the neighborhoods. And I just want to clarify, was that at the time of incorporation? It's in, let's see, housing element. There's a reference in the beginning of the housing element under, let's see, what page is that? Yeah, the very first, under purpose. It says, also indicated was a desire to control the location of attached housing by placing it in the central Kenmore and not dispersing small-scale attached dwellings in neighborhoods. And I just wonder about, when was that, again, dating to incorporation, or is that it's in the very first paragraph there of the housing element?
So so you're talking about the purpose paragraph?
Yeah, the very end of it,
Right,
it
yep.
basically says that there was pushback against what I perceive to be ADUs, so.
So the way I would read that first sentence has nothing to do with ADUs, or that last sentence, I'm sorry, is nothing to do with ADUs. It's more about saying we don't want to do what Seattle talked about a year ago, which is take our single-family neighborhoods and if they were 4 units to the acre, make them 8 units to the acre. We'd rather, in order to accommodate our attached housing, which we need, because in East King County, you're not going to get affordability in general through single-family, let's focus it more in the center of the community. So that wasn't so much a rub against ADUs. It was more a rub against the quantity needed in general. The larger quantities focused that more centrally, and you and almost every other jurisdiction went down a very similar road in the mid-90s, or in the East, and jurisdictions in East King County. So conversations around ADUs have been very positive for the most part.
In Kenmore.
In Kenmore, I haven't seen any pushback per se.
That's maybe I should ask
Right.
Debbie and Lori, do you have any insights at this point on, public? Obviously, we'll get some at some point in this process, but this may be jumping ahead a little bit, but it seems like this is a
Well, we have
strategy we'll be considering.
We have
so.
rules already in place that allow accessory dwelling units. The question then is, are those rules effective and producing ADUs? And if they're not, should we change something, which then gets back to, if we change something, be careful of the consequences. Does it fit then within the community? So does it meet the goals of affordability? And then if it does, is it appropriate for the community and for those neighborhoods?
And my comments were based on experience of helping almost every jurisdiction have this conversation on ADUs and seeing the consistency of the conversation from city to, because trust me, the East King County cities have a consistency, which is strong single-family neighborhoods that everybody really cares about. And so what I'm saying is we have gotten to the point, like if you go to our website, there's a whole section on what it takes to do an ADU. That was because the mayors all got together like 10, 12 years ago, had the regulations on the books and said, no pushback. In fact, if we're hearing anything, why not more? And so what can you do to help us get more? And so that's something I've heard pretty consistently over the years in multiple jurisdictions of, because so far the way it's been happening has worked okay, kind of thing. So, and the reason I bring up Mercer Island is we don't see big pushback in Mercer Island because they have similar protections as other cities, because there are certain protections that are in most of the ordinances, that kind of thing. So I have not witnessed in this city or almost any city since the early 90s. I did go through a big one in one town, but that town in the end still said if you do one thing, we're happy to have them, kind of thing. So that's, and we have that history. We can talk about that with you.
Can we, as long as we're on the subject of ADUs, help me with I think we talked about detached ADUs at some point. Is that mostly what we're talking about, or ADUs within the house?
So in my past, there is not an explicit distinguishment. Most cities allow both. The one city I told you about did not allow detached. And where they're allowed in both, and I think you're a city that probably does too, that the vast majority of ones that are built or created are not in detached structures. There's simple reasons for it. Cost.
Yeah.
But there are cities, many who would do allow detached, and then that's a little bit different. And it's very different than the conversations you've heard in Seattle where they said, let's allow, because again, cities have limited the size of ADUs sometimes, so it is different to talk about detached versus attached, but most cities we've worked it through where they both end up being allowed. But there are usually some special provisions for any new construction, but for existing, but for a detached, there may be a couple other provisions that are looked at. But
is there a different reaction to from the neighbors?
That where it did come up, it gets into issues. The comment that I often make when I start talking about communities is the building envelope that you're allowed to build for an ADU is the same building limit that's allowed for any home. And so, right, auxiliary structures are usually the controlling guidelines often for a detached. So you're not necessarily, especially, creating a different box for ADUs. And so what we find in detached, where we see there are community conversations, it's around a conversation like I know where it came up in Bellevue was big lot homes. Oh, the ADU is closer to the neighbor's home than it is the owner's home. That's one angle, which given most of our lot sizes in the region, that's really not that relevant a question. The other is placement of windows, so for privacy can be an issue. But that's where you can potentially deal with that. But practice also shows that most ADUs, I haven't looked at the records for your city, yes, there are some detached, but they're often buildings that were already kind of there. This isn't trying to encourage that separate ownership unit, take a lot and squeeze another ownership unit in. Those are very different conversations. And Seattle's, I think, has been muddied by those two things, and the emphasis has been detached in their conversations and creating units that can be split off for ownership, whereas an ADU is meant to be a rental unit that is a secondary use type building kind of thing, and often is controlled to be smaller than the other unit, and so there's a whole conversation around ADUs and how you balance neighborhood interests and something that might create some affordability.
Okay. Go ahead, Dennis.
One thing that I haven't heard discussed are the issues of the covenants that are in existing plats and subdivisions that do place a lot of limits, no matter what the city does. But the question I have is, where do we go with those type of limits, and do we have an inventory of them?
So
We don't enforce those. We can only enforce the city rules. Right. So it's up to the homeowners association to enforce any private covenants.
Right.
Well, not all of the covenants in the subdivisions here are controlled by a homeowners association.
Right.
They're controlled by what was written on the plat when it was filed and recorded.
Right.
That's different. If it's a plat condition, again, I think if it's a new plat and there are plat conditions, and that's kind of usually those are in place because they're kind of implementing the rules that the city has. So that's.
I'm talking about pre-city.
Way pre-city. We're in the same.
Yeah.
We've been part of the same process.
I'm just saying there's another overlay here that no matter how much we may think we want to change with the accessory dwelling unit, you may not be able to do it because of existing covenants and conditions that exist from the 20s and 30s.
Yes, and usually what we have found is it's not going to be the ones from the 20s and 30s, it's going to be the ones from the 70s and maybe the 80s. And then builders started to get it, and so there was a narrow time window where a provision that got in the way of ADUs was not uncommon for builders to have, but that wasn't back in the 30s and 40s per se.
Well,
I live in other words, I live in something built in the 70s, and they didn't touch it at all. But I looked at other subdivisions that were done in the 80s or 90s, and we did see, but there may be some out there, but you're right, that point is out there.
I think they were probably in that process of transition in the 60s and 70s, because I think in our area, that's when they were dated.
Right. So,
Just another overlay that
Yeah,
we
it's a
need to
good
keep
point.
in consideration.
Anybody else?
so any other questions or comments about the housing? And we can always come back to them in the future. I just wanted to put that out there first right away. Okay, so now why don't we, now we can pass those things out.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks.
So what we're handing out here is some summaries of two different exercises that we did in the first quarter of this year, and actually one is still a little bit ongoing. And that is that we know a lot of cities are starting this conversation, and there always is interest in understanding different points of view. Or perspectives, or what do experts think, and along those lines. And I have a feeling I forgot to give Mike one page, and yes, I did. I have another page, and we'll supplement that with this material that lists who is involved in each of these conversations, in each of these discussions that you have materials from. I hopefully brought it with me, and I can tell you who, so you get a feel for what perspective this is representing. So the first thing we did, which is the one that there's a chart that says strategy, and it's in two versions. There's a regular portraits approach and there's a landscape approach. Is what we did is we kind of took, it probably looks similar to the outline you have here. And that is, we came up with just about every strategy we could think of, and we put it in as you can see here, a 3+ page list. And we invited people to come and meet with us to talk through them and give us their perspectives. And for this particular meeting is that we brought in people that represented housing professional associations, such as the realtors, the Rental Housing Association, which are multifamily property owners, a couple different realtors. We brought in the Master Builders Association, and then we brought in individuals who are linked to different elements of the development world of housing. So we included a couple architects that are in the, I guess they're both in the private sector, but some of them have designed both market rate and affordable. We brought in 2 bankers who work for major banks in our region, but their job is to focus on their community investment aspects of their banking world. We brought in several private developers, including across the street, and others who've worked on, so market rate private builders, and also private builders who have worked on affordable or like university housing, and have also done some private developers who've used some public funding. And we also brought in, let's see, a perspective on that front. We brought in market rate ownership housing builders, single family, low density, as well as multifamily or condominium. We brought in attorneys who work on affordable housing finance. We brought in a nonprofit who does ownership housing. We brought in nonprofits who do rental housing primarily, and then we brought in a couple people who do homeless housing. And all of these are people who do stuff in East King County. Okay, so when we brought people in, they had these different backgrounds. And who have I forgotten? A couple people, let's see. And we brought in someone who does senior housing, Shag Group, right, who does a number of developments in the area. We brought them in. And then we brought in a little bit smaller scale private builders who do stuff in East King County, both ownership and rental, smaller multifamily scale. So we really tried to find a cross-section of different, and then we brought in property managers, people who do property management, both small scale and large scale. And then we brought in some interest. We did bring in one interest group, but I think they didn't come to we invited a group that sort of looks at renters people who try to look out for the interests of rental households, but I don't think we had that at the meeting. So a wide range of types of people who are involved in the creation of housing, market rate, and affordable and homeless in our communities in East King County. And so in that exercise, we sent out the list in advance, and when we sent it out, we said, tell us things you think we should rate high, and tell us if you think there are some that we should rate low. And what's interesting is you have very wide range of perspectives, and so it starts to show. And I'm not going to, my interest tonight is not to go through and highlight highs and lows. It's just to give it to you to start looking at, and we can come back and talk about more. And I can, and if I had to, I can tell you who are the ones who rated things higher and lower and stuff, but you've probably been around and you can probably start figuring out some of that yourself. Then the other thing we did is we had a comments column. So the second document I gave you is I just took the comments they put in and I just verbatim threw them in the chart. Okay? And so, and again, I did it color-coded so I know who everybody's was when I gave it to you. It's just the fonts weren't legible for you, so it's all one font color. But again, just to give you a sense of the range of kind of comments you get on different strategies. Then the last thing we did, the third document, is just a one-pager where we took some of the comments and put them all together on one page. And these were comments about what do you think are the most pressing issues for housing? And so this is just sort of a summary of some of the comments we received. So no real attempt by us to filter. It's meant to just be a broad, just here it is. And then we got them all, and we did this before the meeting, then they all got together and they talked more about this, and we have notes from that as well. That I haven't finalized and did not give you, but there's a lot of overlap between the conversation and the meeting and what they gave us in advance. So that's what that document is. Then the other thing we thought another angle to take is we gave you the housing needs analysis, and that gives you a lot of data in terms of data. And what we did is we said, let's interview. Let's not do a group meeting. Let's do one-on-one interviews with players in East King County. And again, a similar cross-section. And here, we didn't go to the attorneys or the financiers. We went to the people who own and operate or are selling units or selling homes or renting and asked, what are you experiencing when you are dealing directly with consumers, and what is your opinion about what's going on out there? And as you can see, we asked them 8 questions, and what I thought might be helpful, and this is where I haven't got through all these. I was gone for over a month, and we have interviews from, I think, about a dozen agencies. And as I said, we've got homeless agencies, nonprofit housers, and we also have talked to some private market people as well. And I think we still may have 1 or 2 of those to do. And the questions we asked are, what are the issues you've seen in the past 10 years? And what do you think you see coming down the pike the next 10 years? Then are there certain particular population, tell us about from a demographic point of view, are there certain things that are coming out to your attention? And then we asked, what are some ways to address? And then what are you hearing from residents that are in your properties, especially for the affordable housing? And what are you hearing for people trying to get into your properties, especially in the affordable housing? And then we asked, what do you think is going on out there that people in East King County don't know is going on out there? So that's what question 6 is about. And what are some ideas? And then finally, we sort of, kind of a similar question as one of the earliers, is just what's the most significant issue in your perspective, and what might we do about it? So that has a lot of overlap with the other exercise we did. And then, do you have any other comments and observations? I've only done like 4 of the responses in this here, so when I'm done, it's going to be about 8 pages. And it'll probably be each page will have a question, because there's so much overlap, I might just start, not repeating. I didn't want, like right now we have 30 pages of notes. And I know that's hard, so we're trying to boil that down to like a page per question of the highlights by the different sectors that we see. So this is meant, again, it might lead you to have some questions. Could you follow up? Would you, I work with all of these people all the time, so I'm more than happy to follow up. Some of the cities have big budgets and they're doing more elaborate things. we'll share you that, when we're getting that information to what we're hearing in those as well. There may be some point where you want to have a group of people come talk with you. But what this isn't doing is that other half that we talked about earlier, the community perspective half. And we figure you have that perspective, but at some point, like right now, Bellevue is doing a general survey of their community, so it's available to anyone. And my guess, we can share you results from that. If there's something you want to have a meeting where you invite the public in at some point to get that other side, because I don't think you want to get ahead. You don't just listen to this voice. You've got to listen to the community voice equally, or have a sense for it. And if you have a sense for it, because you live in the neighborhood, so you're a resident of this community, that's fine. If not, and let's just make sure, and this is where the principals, I think, is a really good tool to use to bring that voice in. So I'll say it one more time, because I say it 3 times to make sure you understand. We really didn't come in the room and say, oh, you care about community, so we got to figure it out. This was just because we wanted to give you that side, but the community voice is equally important. And so as we think about that, that's something we may want to think more about how to deal with that. But there are other cities that may be doing some outreach that might be helpful. Just like we did this, we may have some outreach from other things that we can share with you as well. But I've been in a lot of neighborhood meetings over the years too, and I have a pretty good feel as well, just because I've been in the middle of these conversations, just as you have. So this is just another tool for you. We can get to this to you electronically, or to help you as we add on to the last piece. The first 2 or 3 pieces are essentially done, but again, it's just another resource for you.
So something that occurs to me is whether Kenmore is really representative of the rest of East King County.
Mm-hmm.
We're taking all this data from these East King County cities. I'm looking at a page from, I can't remember which attachment it was. Footer says, Housing Strategy Plan, Affordable Senior Housing, Exhibit P-1. I think it was in the last attachment. And it shows home sale prices. It's a little cryptic. I don't know if it's median or average. And it shows all East King County cities.
Mm-hmm.
The average, and this is a little dated, it says this is only up to 2013. The average for East King County cities is approximately $567,000. I don't know if that's average. It's just under the category all,
Mm-hmm.
That's the number. Under that category for Kenmore, it's $358,000. It's more than $200,000 difference. It's 38% different.
Mm-hmm.
And Kenmore is the lowest by about $60,000, $65,000 of all these other cities. And it's like 15%. They're 15%. We're 15% lower than the next cheapest city in East King County.
Mm-hmm.
So I see all this survey information about East King County and what are our problems. It looks like we are in a materially different segment of the market than they are. And I'm not sure how applicable this is.
Well, and that's for each of you to have an opinion on, right? And part of what I would say is when you have those kind of questions, ask them, and then we'll probe a little bit more. And you've raised similar questions before. A comment I would make is, well, if we're focusing on affordability, we're focusing on those first 3, and there's maybe a half column, especially for ownership at median income. And one thing I think that we did tell you about is you're having an increase in cost burden households, higher proportion than other cities. There's other stories about your cities, or for ownership, maybe it gets to, because maybe there's 1 or 2 pieces of data that we need to probe a little bit more on to help you understand it. Because one thing that would be said is, well, while 358, and that's 2 years old, so now it's probably 450,000. Yeah. Based on median income, that's not affordable at median income. And so as you still may have an issue, and if I measure you against Shoreline, you'd be the leader of the pack maybe. So it's sometimes it's about looking at your population and the income that you brought up at the very beginning and say, okay, we're relatively well off, but still how much of a challenge is it? And given where we're at, does that give us, maybe we have some strategies around ownership that can help a little better because our condition's a little different.
Because part of this, is what is the degree of the problem for Kenmore? I mean, I see it as, okay, this is an issue. City Council wants to address it. It's a regional issue. One reason I think Arch is really helpful, it's like transportation. You know, it's just, you know, if City A has affordable housing, what does it do to City B? And is there a better place to provide affordable housing than pick your city, than Kenmore? And so to what extent, if it's a relatively low problem for Kenmore, I say relatively because it's a problem. I'm not trying to minimize it, but relative to the rest of East King County, we're way more affordable. How much of our policy and resources should go toward it? Knowing that this is a minimizing the burden kind of issue. We're never going to, I don't know a city that's fixed affordable housing or has a silver bullet for fixing affordable housing. If there were, I think a lot of people would be doing it. There wouldn't be hollahs going on for years with dozens of members fighting over what policy to adopt to fix it. I wonder when I look at this, is there a better city to compare us to in terms of policy and needs and data than the ones that are on this list that are at least 15% higher and on average 38% higher?
Right. And that's why I'm saying on some of these it may be helpful to look in your data a little more because if you look at it that way, you can come to your conclusion. I think you look at it different ways. There's some pretty significant needs, and part of the dilemma is the shifting that's going on. You know, we gave you the data on people who are cost burdened and severely cost burdened. Your income profile of your workforce, are you going to try to house your workforce? You want economic development, well, here's your workforce. So there's other pieces of information. So, yes, you need to look at your picture and think it through from your picture's point of view. And all I guess I'm asking is don't oversimplify. We're less than them, so that means maybe we don't have such an issue.
No, I'm not. Well, we may not, actually. That, I think, is a legitimate point. We're less than them. We don't have as much of an issue. But you're right. Income has a bearing on this, too, although Kenmore's income is about 15% higher than the King County median, too. We're at 82, and King County's in the high 60s.
No, what I'm saying is your workforce income.
Yeah. And what segment of our market is that? I mean, are you talking about the people who work in Kenmore?
Yeah.
And what can they afford?
Yes.
The people who live here, there's what, 3-4% who live here and work here?
Right.
So are we, putting way more resources into a very small problem if we're talking about 3% of Kenmore? I don't know. I'm just trying to put perspective on all of this.
Right, and that perspective, that one is one that says, well, who takes care of, I mean, this is why I do what I do for as long as I have, is to say, well, the people aren't living here, so it's not an issue. Well, maybe there's other reasons they're not living here.
Maybe.
And so that's, that's the easy, I'll be sort of frank, that's the easy way to make it so someone else deals with the need. The cities in South King County, listen to their conversations. We're taking all the low-income employees from the East King County, and we're the ones housing, and then some of the issues you raised about service needs, et cetera, but we don't have the economic base.
Well, but is that a bad thing for affordable housing? I mean, if the land is cheaper in South King County, and
I'm just letting you understand that different perspectives that different areas have.
Because I see, transportation is a big part of this, and I've said that at the last meeting. I see very little discussion of transportation here, but I think
you will see it in the comments.
For that,
you will see it in the comments,
and that's why I think Arch could play such an important role in this, because you're a regional entity, right? You're trying to build or fund affordable housing all over King County, right?
We only do East King County.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Good to know.
And we were really created, we're not a separate entity. We are a collection of cities that use Arch to help them in their local work. Now, the trust fund, I think, creates some misunderstandings because the cities recognize when Arch was formed, it was a citizens task force idea. They came up with the roadmap. I was sitting in the room, and we've tried to stick to the roadmap, which has been, how do we help cities who have, even though they don't create all the housing, how do they affect the housing needs that we are having in our communities? That almost everything I work on is trying to address needs that aren't South King County has a housing problem and we're trying to take care of it. It's we're generating needs locally, and that the issue and why ARCH was formed, the Citizens Task Force came up with the idea, was cities do have a role, but it's a complicated topic and we don't have specialized staff. So if we create this organization, we can hire staff who we each get to have tap into, and we will only, and what the other thing to create efficiency is draw the boundaries of who we want to be, what cities we want as members of this, because we have similar issues. And by having similar issues, when we research it in one town, it doesn't mean we create the solution for all the towns, but the experience of that other town and the solutions will help really inform. And so we can be an efficient staff to a number of cities because we're working on very similar issues across the board. The third aspect, which got unique and what led it, is to say that the boundary for Bothell is a mile from here, and if Bothell has a housing need, but the unit lands 50 yards in Kenmore or a mile into Kenmore, that's still in the same market area and will benefit Bothell, whereas if it's built in South King County, they got to commute an hour and a half. And so housing market boundaries are defined a little differently than city boundaries. And so that's what then led to the philosophy. It's worth funding cities putting their money in a pot together. But every dime we spend, the councils first decide how much money they put in the pot, and then they decide which projects to fund. We give them recommendations. But the idea is that over time, it's not like your money's always going somewhere else. It's over time, projects are big and complicated. It's better to have a big pool of money so that you can fund the best projects wherever they are, but over time you hope to get balance throughout East King County, so that each city does get affordable housing through the funding the most efficient way possible. But it's still, we are not a legal entity. My board of directors are the city managers of the cities who are members of ARCH. So all we really are is like a housing department. But the unique nature is you talk to each other more because of that, because we serve you all.
What do these other cities, they look at this chart and they look at Kenmore and they think you're only addressing housing problems in East King County, right?
We're only focusing on working with the cities in East King County and their housing needs, correct?
And you're not funded by cities elsewhere?
No. It's the cities in East King County only.
I thought you were county-wide or
No.
broader than
The county's a member because there's unincorporated. The world has changed. When we were incorporated, you weren't. And so you were part of East King County, but not as a city. So
If I'm in Bellevue or Kirkland, I'm at the top of this list, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mercer Island, $1 million. Who's $2 million? Medina,
Mm-hmm.
2.1. And you come to me, Arthur, and say, we got to do something about affordable housing. Nobody
Mm-hmm.
can afford to live here that makes less than $200,000 a year. If I were on the Medina City Council and you came to me and I looked at this, I go, well, the answer, Arthur, is to build more affordable housing in Kenmore so that people can commute from Kenmore to Medina and live in a decent
So you want to
structure
hear,
in Kenmore.
you want to hear an interesting story?
I'm up for it.
You were the last city, one of the last to join, because you're one of the new cities. The members of ARCH almost didn't want you to join because of that. They wanted to make sure that by having the lowest cost area within our sphere, that would not happen. They wanted to make sure they continued to use their resources throughout East King County, and not to focus it just because it's the lowest cost area of East King County, because of all the other principles that went into why we have ARCH, or why the city's created ARCH. Now, so just so that you're aware, that was an explicit conversation that this organization had, was to make sure that that philosophy did not go into its thinking.
Well,
And
if we're looking at efficiency, that would seem to be the most efficient way to provide affordable
Well,
housing for East King County. And the way
We're
I
taking a
look
lot of
at
time.
it is-
I would be happy offline to sort of explain. There's a whole lot of different angles. Remember I said this is not a zero-sum game?
Yeah.
I can also show you that, but because land costs are really high, when you do density bonuses there, they're worth a lot more.
Yeah,
Now I can get into hard economics, right?
it's worth more, but it's still expensive. It's like
Right.
if you get a 50% discount on a Mercedes, gee, how can you pass that up? Well, it's still 50 grand. I can't afford it. I look at this as there are much less expensive. There's much less expensive land in this area to build or subsidize affordable housing, then Kenmore, I would be looking at this the way Medina would look at Kenmore. I'd be looking at South King County.
Right.
If I were thinking,
And what
what's the
we're
most
saying
efficient
is,
way to provide housing
GMA
for
says not to do it think that way, and our organizations explicitly, we had cities outside of East King County asked to join, and we said, no, create your own partnership. The idea of ARCH is create a resource for cities that face similar issues and create efficiency and governance by creating staff who, if I went to South County, I would take a very different approach.
And not just there, but Snohomish County.
Right, exactly.
Far East, or Duval, or something
Right.
like that. I would think, gee, that's a lot more efficient to provide affordable housing because the land costs are so much lower.
Well, you haven't looked at land costs in Duval lately.
Is it lower than Kenmore?
But the point I'm making is, the idea is
There
that
are other places.
so what your group is tasked to do is, within the context of housing needs in your community, come up with the plan that works for your community. And there's some danger in looking at someone else. Yes, look at yours, but a lot of times it's helpful to understand how you do fit in, and that may influence you to some degree, but that doesn't relieve or that. You have needs that are in here that we've identified and are in your housing element, and you've got policies around. So the question is, how are you going to go out? Should some of this influence your thinking, just like some of the other things you talked about earlier tonight? Potentially. But to sort of have that be a conclusion, we don't have a need, I think that wouldn't be the direction we heard from council.
And I'm not saying zero, and I haven't at any point. I say
Right.
it's all a matter of degree.
Right.
And to me, efficiency is high on the list. So
Right.
that's going to be, I think, how that perspective would look at this. But I'll let you continue.
Well, no, I think I got through the material there. And so now we're, I think, to the point where we would have started talking about strategies specifically to seniors. You've asked for a little bit different approach to it. Whether or not you still want to, so we don't spend a lot of time on that tonight, but if you want to spend some time looking at the list as we've given you, I'd say it's almost as much for clarification right now, given the earlier conversation. And then probably the wrap-up would be, okay, how would you like the next conversation for the next thing, and how does that work? Is it the full if we had consensus on trying to do it more by type of strategies rather than population, then we'll, as staff, need to think that through and get that for you. But I think at this point, see if there's any immediate questions on this or what conversation, and then would be, okay, let's set up your next conversation.
Floor is open. Any questions on this? Okay. How do we set up the next meeting? Ideas?
We need to decide on a date. I mean,
Start with that.
well, I guess I'd propose that, maybe to compromise, since, I mean, the council does take August off. My recollection from way back is that we married with their schedule, but apparently that hasn't happened in the last few years. So I guess my proposal would be to go to one meeting if we have to compromise. I would rather not have any in August, but if we need to. So I guess I'd put that forward. My first proposal would be none. If that doesn't go anywhere, then maybe compromising at one.
The key to that question, who's going to be here and able to come?
Or willing to come.
Willing, yes.
I mean,
Willing, better put.
Yeah.
Willing to come.
so,
If
yeah,
you're not
I
here,
don't
you're
know.
not willing.
I don't know, yeah.
So you may not be here for the month of August.
I was assuming that we were off in August, but.
You're not so willing to come,
I'm
regardless
not
of where you are.
particularly willing to come, yes.
Mike?
I cannot be here on August
Okay.
5th, at our next meeting, but I'm willing to consider other times.
Like August 19th?
Yes.
The 2nd and the 16th are the meetings.
The
The
2nd. and the
August 2nd and August 16th.
I will be out of the country.
On the 2nd?
On the 2nd,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, 16th may work?
Yes.
Okay, Carol?
I'm available.
Okay,
I'm available both.
yep, I could probably do it. Yep, Mike?
I believe I'm unavailable on the 2nd, available on the 16th.
Okay. Sounds like we're going to have at least 5. There's a good chance we'll have at least 5 on the 2nd and 6 or 7 on the 16th. Sounds like we're at least keeping the 16th.
You'd have 4 on the 2nd. He's not available, and we're not available on the 2nd. So
I'm sorry.
You'd have 4 on the 2nd and 5 on the 16th, unless I
So
I would, as always, do my best to call in.
Yeah. So it might be by telephone. You guys can grant proxies if you like, but it's better at this stage. I don't think the proxies are going to help much because at this stage we're still brainstorming. So what do you guys think? Do we cancel the 2nd and just do the 16th? That's, I think, what Deb's got on the table. Does anybody second that, so to speak?
I would second that.
Do we want to vote on it? Whether we stay on, whether we meet on the 2nd? All in favor say aye, or raise your hand.
Sorry,
I'm
we're
willing.
voting for the second?
Yeah, the 2nd. Willing to give it a
I can vote for it, but I won't be here.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to say that, I mean, the best case is that we've got 4 who show and Mike who calls. So it sounds like we're up for doing it, trying it on the 2nd.
Yeah.
Yeah. What bearing does that have on it?
Almost feels like you want a full list, and we'll just start at the top and keep going
Yeah.
through it.
That's a good reason. Yeah, I'd probably, in light of that, and especially because I'm the troublemaker, I'd be inclined to give them more time. And it is, as I said, it's sort of a brainstorming thing. It's great to have everybody here sort of early on, so we get the.
So what are you proposing?
So I'm kind of leaning now towards let's cancel the 2nd.
Just go with the 16th.
But that means 1, 2, 3 for cancel. Do we have 4 for keeping it?
I'm indifferent.
Sounds like a lot of indifference here.
You go either way.
Okay, that sounds like there's enough more weight on the side of canceling than there is on the side of keeping it. So let's cancel the 2nd, stick with the 16th. Is that?
All right. And that also lets me take the other part of the conversation and give us some time to start thinking about the principles or guiding principles and start framing that part as well.
Okay,
And
good.
thinking
Yeah,
that
that's right.
through.
I think it'd be more efficient that way. They'll be better prepared too. All right, so that's that. And then the next question I think, Art, that you want answered is how do we approach the next meeting, the 16th, right?
Is there more to add from what we talked about earlier? I mean, I think we can take from what you described earlier to try to do something, but if there's more guidance you want to talk about.
Anybody?
I'll just summarize what I think we heard.
Please.
Okay.
One, which is you put together a draft set of guiding principles we would look at on the 16th, and then we would begin to work through your graphic here, but we're going to be focusing on the leftmost strategy column. So I'm assuming you would use your judgment to decide which items in this toolkit we'd be talking about on the 16th.
Right, which means I
Separate
need to
the-
sort of create the full list, whereas now you only have a partial list.
Right.
Right,
So
yes.
your decision needs to be made, which I suggest we delegate to you, to make
Right.
which one of those strategies, or which of those strategies, which one we talk about on the 16th. And I also heard I think we had a general consensus, we want to have some sort of a timeline that would say, here's where we're going to be talking about each one of these strategies on what days. That's what I remember.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I was hoping we could get sort of for every strategy, what has been your experience on the opposing position? You know, is there a negative response? How strong is it, and what is it specifically?
When you say, are you referring to like from a neighborhood community point of view? Okay.
Yeah. or
Okay, that's,
Mostly from a
sometimes
neighborhood, because
sometimes
those are the
it's-
ones who typically respond strongly.
well, actually, often it's like if you have a mandatory affordable, the private sector, the developer sector has a negative reaction to it.
Then absolutely.
Okay,
Every element of opposition to it, we should
Right.
factor into it.
okay. We can, right, so now I'm glad we're,
Now you really need the extra 2 weeks to the best, to the extent you can.
right.
Efficiency factor is a good point.
So anything else on how we structure the next meeting? Are we good? All right.
And just one more, what we'll
Yeah.
do is the population columns, will fill that in for all populations.
Okay,
Okay?
great. All right. So you guys, staff and Arch, have you completed your presentation? Is there anything else? You're good? All right. Commissioners, is there anything else? Questions? Any new business? There being none, I hereby adjourn this meeting.